This is the fifth video in our language module. Again, you should be reading chapter 5. Let's look at our learning objectives for this video. There are three. First, we're going to look at that Indo-European geography or its footprint one more time. And we're going to look at it with just a little bit more of an eye for some detail. Then we're going to move on to the origins and the expansion of three important languages, or in some cases language families. And the argument that I want all of you to keep in the back of your mind is this one right here. If a language or a language family started small but then grew large over time to encompass something like 25 or even 50% of the world's speakers, as is the case with the Indo-European languages, it must be because that language had power marshaled behind it, whether it's cultural, economic, political, or what have you. So we're going to look at exactly three examples of that to illustrate that idea, and that will be our conclusion with respect to our discussion of language. So let's start out then by looking at that footprint of the Indo-European languages once again. Remember that all of the languages that fall into the Indo-European language family are related to one another. They all descend from one single mother tongue that was spoken a long time ago in the distant human past. And then, of course, languages that are color-coded similarly are even more closely related to one another, as English is to German, French is to Italian. And of course, the same thing is true over here. In Iran, they speak Persian, which is closely related, because it's in the same sub-branch of the Indo-European language family, to Hindi, which is spoken in northern India. Now, what I want to do here with respect to looking at just a little bit more detail is I want to point out some of the places where you have a language that is not Indo-European. So, to give just one example, notice that Hungary is color-coded gray, and so is Finland. Remember that both Hungarian and Finnish are spoken in those two countries, and they are not Indo-European, they are Uralic. And guess what? They're related to one another, but they're very much unrelated to any of the other European languages. So to spin it just a little bit more differently, English, which is spoken over here on the island of Britain, is actually more closely related to Hindi, which is spoken way over here, than it is to either Finnish or Hungarian. And the reason why that is the case is that both English and Hindi are Indo-European, but Hungarian and Finnish are not. There are some other things that we can see by looking at the details of this particular map. Over here in Turkey, remember that Turkish is an Altaic language. It's still Nostratic, a part of the big language family, coming from the same trunk, but it's a different branch. And so the Turkish language is also distinct from all of the other Indo-European languages. Languages related to Turkish include this area right in through here. That includes all of the Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, to name just a few. And in fact, this whole region right through here is essentially an Altaic region in culture, with a lot of similarities and historical ties. What I want to do now is illustrate this idea of power. And I want to talk about how some languages have benefited by having power marshaled behind them. And the three that I'm going to give are Indo-European, Arabic, and Bantu. The first, of course, is a language family, which we've already spent quite a bit of time talking about. The Indo-European languages, again, they all descend from one single mother tongue, spoken a long time ago. What we're going to call that single mother tongue that gave birth to all of the Indo-European languages, we will call it Proto-Indo-European, which means early Indo-European. And if you look over here on this map right here, there is an area where linguists and historians think that Indo-European languages originated. It's an area called the Kurgan Hearth, and hence the idea of describing how and why Indo-European languages originated and then grew is called the Kurgan theory of Indo-European origin and expansion. Let's firstly just identify where that area is. It's basically in what is today modern-day Kazakhstan and Russia, right on the border, in basically the heart of Central Asia. That area right there, perhaps about 7,000 years ago, is where that original Proto-Indo-European mother tongue was spoken. And for some reason, the people who spoke that language were able to spread their culture over a really large geographic area. And over time, they spread so far into places like Great Britain, into parts of what is today Iran, and if we could kind of imagine where this map would go, into India, that each one of these regions, that Proto-Indo-European mother tongue, would have evolved along its own independent trajectory, ultimately giving us all of the different, unique Indo-European languages. Now, there are some theories as to why this happened. It is hypothesized that the people who spoke this Proto-Indo-European language about 7,000 years ago had actually first mastered the use of the horse, and that gave them incredible military power. They could trade over long distances, and they had a new tool in terms of military conquest. As a result, their language spread over a really large geographic area. And this image right here is taken in what is today Kazakhstan, to give you a sense of what this area looks like. It's also the place where it is thought that humans first mastered the use of the horse as a domesticated tool. And the result is that over time, this culture was able to spread over a really large geographic area. So much so that today, about, 50% of the world's population basically speaks a language that is the descendant, or one of the descendants, of this original Proto-Indo-European language. Now, the same thing can be said about other languages. In this case, I'm not looking at an entire language family, but just one specific language, and that's Arabic. Arabic expanded in a similar kind of way. There was a time, not that long ago, perhaps about 14 or 1500 years ago, maybe a little bit further, where Arabic was only spoken right in through here. It was kind of a small, marginal language. But it grew. It grew quickly. It pushed into all of northern Africa, so that today just about everyone who lives in northern Africa speaks Arabic. It also pushed into what we today call the Middle East, Iraq and Jordan and Syria, and so on. The question becomes, why? Why did Arabic go from being a tiny, marginal, kind of very, very obscure language, spoken only in one tiny corner of the world, to becoming quite literally one of the world's most important languages? Again, it is power. In this case, it doesn't really have anything to do with a new tool like the domestication of the horse, but rather the energizing power of the advent of Islam. Islam is what propelled Arabic to what in this case looks like a very large geographic area stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Indian Ocean. So it's a different type of power. It's the power of a new religion, a religion that had great resonance and the ability to attract new followers. And if you were to convert to Islam, let's say in the year 800 AD, you might also learn Arabic, because the Quran is only published in Arabic. And so what that means is there's kind of an incentive to learn Arabic, and thus this therefore explains how Arabic was able to grow and become so much more dominant over a larger geographic area. And finally, I want to give the example of what happened in sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, a really large geographic area, about 2,000 years ago, there were more than 400,000 different languages. Today there's probably only about 1,000. So there's been a great reduction in the number of languages that are spoken in sub-Saharan Africa. The reason is that there is one group of languages, they're called Bantu languages, that at one time, again about 2,000 years ago, were spoken only in one tiny part of sub-Saharan Africa, in what is today basically Cameroon. But for reasons we don't fully understand, the Bantu region and the culture of the Bantu began to spread over huge parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And as a result of becoming the dominant culture in sub-Saharan Africa, other people who didn't speak a Bantu language basically adapted to this new reality, and they converted to speaking the Bantu languages. And so it is thought that it has to do with agriculture, meaning the people who are a part of the original Bantu culture became very skilled at agriculture, thus they had a food surplus, thus they could trade, thus they became wealthier, and over time they became the dominant culture in this part of the world. And so just like Arabic in Northern Africa or Indo-European languages in Eurasia, in this particular example, again, the same thing is true. Languages that were weak got marginalized and smaller. Languages that, for whatever reason, had power marshaled behind them eventually grew and became dominant. This then leads to one final interesting observation. What do you suppose will happen in the future? What's the world going to look like in 100 years' time? Well, a lot of people think that both English and Chinese will continue to grow, just because the United States has the world's largest economy and China probably has the world's fastest growing economy. Spanish as well will continue to grow, but there will likely be fewer languages in the future than there is today. And that is because languages continue to die or quite literally go extinct. Native American tongues, for example, where you only have a few people left who still speak them. And it's generally the older people. And when they die, they take the language with them to their grave. And so just the young people are left speaking perhaps English or maybe Spanish. Well, that process occurs everywhere. And so what we're looking at then is probably greater levels of language homogeneity in the near future, which is probably a bad thing, but again, we don't know exactly for sure how this process is going to play out.